It's a once-in-a-generation investment in America, unlike anything we've seen or done.
Joe Biden announcing plans for a massive once-in-a-generation infrastructure package. It comes with a once-in-a-generation price tag and tax hikes to pay for it. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Biden's $2.2 trillion plan is about a lot more than roads and bridges. It aims to deal with climate change, poverty, and food insecurity while creating jobs. The proposal is being met with skepticism from some congressional Republicans and flat-out opposition from others. Also on Biden's front burner, Georgia, only the first state to pass a major law to limit voting. Dozens more are in the works around the country. Democrats considering curbing the filibuster in order to pass a voting rights bill, and just how far are they willing to go? Meanwhile, some historians are calling Biden's ambitious, aggressive agenda transformative, comparing it to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Or, given the divisive political environment, is Biden going too far, too fast? Plenty to talk about with the Times' op-ed columnist. We're joined by Michelle Goldberg, who has been a columnist for the Times since 2017, and Bret Stephens also joined the Times op-ed page in 2017, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2013. Let me ask both of you, we are sort of closing in on that arbitrary, magical 100-day figure in the Biden administration. Michelle, let me start with you. Is the Biden administration what you expected it to be when he started out in January?
It has far exceeded my expectations. I'm obviously a Democrat. I was not a supporter of Biden in the primary. I thought he was too staid, too cautious, too conservative. I had a sense after he was elected, just from the people he was bringing into the transition and the people that he was nominating, that he was going to, kind of be a president for the entire Democratic Party and make real outreach or inroads to the progressive wing of the party, which has grown a lot stronger. I also, if you talk to Obama veterans, they've learned a lot of lessons from the early years of the Obama administration, both in kind of the futility of trying to tie bipartisanship to getting buy-in from a few Republican members of Congress, as opposed to just kind of passing popular legislation. And I also think they've learned a lesson about the dangers of going too small, of sort of not passing the kind of disaster relief needed, and as a result, seeing the economy limp along for a lot longer than it has to. So I was optimistic. I wrote pieces early on suggesting that Biden could be a transformative president, in part because I think that there are parallels between, not moral parallels, mind you, but just sort of structural parallels between Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter, both sort of, somewhat calamitous presidencies, although one far more calamitous than the other, that really marked the end of a particular ideological era, and were followed by presidents who had the opportunity to sort of inaugurate a new dispensation. So I thought Biden had that chance, and I think he is seizing that chance even more than I would have expected.
Bret, what do you think? You seem to say in a number of columns in the Times that he's gone a little bit too far, and has he lived up to your expectations, or in a different way exceeded them than the way Michelle envisioned him?
Well, he exceeded my expectations by beating Donald Trump. I was worried about his chances, and I think I'll be forever grateful to him for ending that particular national nightmare. I thought the promise of the Biden presidency, and one of the reasons why I wrote nice columns about him way back in 2019 and early 2020, was that he could be not another Lyndon Johnson, but maybe another Bill Clinton, at least in terms of policy, a president who would sort of recenter the nation by being a Democrat sort of an old school Democrat who had a sense of bipartisanship, not treating Republicans as enemies, and trying to combination down. I'm not sure he is achieving that with his ambitions, which I think I definitely agree with Michelle. They're extraordinary. I don't think we've seen early days of a presidency like this, at least in terms of the amount of spending, in a long time. But I basically see the great American problem today as a form of political polarization as extreme as any in my lifetime, and maybe in yours, Sam. Going back to
Even mine, Bret. Yes.
even yours. I meant that in a respectful way. And this is going to lead, I'm afraid, to partisan blowback. I think it's going to embolden some of the worst elements of the Republican Party, which are plentiful. And I worry that Biden is also losing an opportunity to pass some of the legislation that I was, exceedingly hopeful he could pass, particularly when it comes to comprehensive immigration reform, which was the subject of my last column, and which I think we desperately need.
I want to talk to you about that again in a moment. Michelle, Thomas Edsall had a column in the Times the other day that talked about a very interesting phenomenon, fear on the part of the white majority in this country, which, arguably is really not a white majority when you include the fact that there are so many interracial marriages and the fact that so many Hispanic people identify themselves as white also. But he talked about the fact that Biden is trying to create a multiracial coalition by winning over working class whites, by dispersing substantial benefits in his stimulus bill, and at the same time targeting generous programs to racial and ethnic minorities to reduce disparities in income and education. Is that going to be a successful strategy, or is it going to backfire, as Bret says, and create a big backlash on the part of so-called white ethnics?
Well, look, I don't think that there's anything that Biden could do that you wouldn't see a tremendous right-wing backlash. I mean, obviously, there's nothing that Bill Clinton did that calmed the sort of partisan warfare in this country. And I would argue that Bill Clinton was operating in a very different political context in which the sort of assumptions of Reaganism were still dominant, and everybody had to operate within that framework. And that framework has collapsed under the weight of its own failures and contradictions. So I don't think that, look, that it's been a long time since any it's been a long time since any Democrat has won the majority of white voters. And I would be surprised if Joe Biden became the first, but I think he can win over some, or he can lose by less by making a real tangible difference in people's lives. And that's why I think he was so smart to start first with the rescue package and then with this very ambitious infrastructure package. I mean, you keep seeing Republicans wanting to pivot to culture war issues, right? Wanting to talk about, the kind of tyrannical, the incipient tyranny of Dr. Seuss the Dr. Seuss estate deciding to take a couple of books out of circulation. And you see the Biden administration just not taking the bait. They just really want to talk about these big, bold initiatives that are meant to put money in people's pockets.
And Bret, can they afford to stick to those issues? And are those issues, as you sort of suggested, too big? Or can Republicans legitimately oppose things like building roads, building schools, building public works that give people jobs?
Look, up to a point, public works are great. I mean, even Republicans don't like potholes, and believe in 21st century infrastructure projects. Nobody's advocating for rebuilding the Erie Canal. Maybe it's going to work for Biden. I voted for President Biden. I was delighted when he won. I want him to succeed. My big fear is that he's going to lose not the far right wing or the right wing, but he's going to lose those centrist voters. I mean, look, he's taking a tremendous gamble by injecting trillions of dollars into an economy that is already moving into a boom period. And we're going to see how long it lasts. It reminds me of a comment purportedly made by Napoleon's mother when she was asked about her son's military victories. She said in Corsican, "Pourvu que ça dure," for as long as it lasts. So we'll see.
You're one of the few people who know to be able to say that in Corsican.
Well, I'm sure there's someone who's going to correct me on that. So I'm open. If I got it wrong, I'd be happy to be corrected.
Michelle, you mentioned Dr. Seuss, and you've written about critical race theory and the assaults from both the right and the left. How do we deal with talking to each other in a more rational way without dealing with the cancel culture, without dealing with woke, with just being able to speak to each other frankly about controversial issues? How do we do that anymore, particularly on college campuses where everything that's said from the left or the right seems to aggravate tensions, aggravate people, and you just can't say things anymore the way you used to, for better or for worse.
And I think for better or for worse is the key phrase, right? Because there's some things that we used to say that I think everybody or most everybody would agree that there are now taboos against, kind of the use of casual slurs about, developmental disabilities or, sort of casually sexist language. I think that even people who really resent some of these new sort of speech norms would flinch at things that we used to say quite casually, 20 or 30 years ago. And so that said, I think that you need to have a commitment to old-fashioned free speech. And, I've been critical at times of the left about this, but I really truly believe, even though I don't think that, I think it's, it kind of goes very much against most people's assumptions, that the real threat, the primary threat to free speech on college campuses right now, maybe not to Harvard and Berkeley and kind of colleges on the coast, but most of the colleges in this country, the real censorship threat comes from the right. It comes from these legislative initiatives to ban discussion of critical race theory, ban the teaching of the New York Times' own 1619 project. Some people will say that this stuff is just directed at kind of coercive programs in elementary schools, but the way that they're worded, they end up applying to what can be taught in universities. And you hear from professors, again, I think that we hear a lot from conservative students who feel like they're tiptoeing around, tiptoeing around progressive orthodoxies on elite college campuses. There's a lot of liberal and left professors on maybe less elite college campuses in red states, who constantly feel that they're walking on eggshells, who constantly worry about something that they say getting recorded and filtered into the right-wing media and kind of creating a big blow up. And it's been really heartening to see that you see free speech activists on the right who've really started to recognize this as a problem. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, I wouldn't necessarily consider them right. I think that most people consider them libertarian, although they certainly defend a lot of right-wing professors and students, have come out very strongly against a lot of this legislation and even compared it to the initiatives that you see against gender studies in countries like Hungary, where they've taken this fairly obscure academic discipline and tried to turn it into a symbol of everything that they hate about the modern world.
Bret, quickly, in half a minute, do you want to respond to Michelle?
Sure. I mean, I guess I've been someone who's been, canceled by on occasion by right as well as left. So I agree with Michelle's point that it's a fully bipartisan phenomenon. Look, I'm not opposed to the idea that we have to be, I favor the idea that we have to be more sensitive to certain kinds of speech that we used to not think twice about. Question has to do with the penalties, which is to say, is the penalty going to be the loss of job, reputational annihilation? Or is the penalty going to be, we shouldn't talk like that anymore? Is it going to be a matter of coercion or education? And I think that there's a huge difference. And when we talk about cancel culture, when we talk about real people losing their jobs or being destroyed and having their reputations destroyed or their books withdrawn, those are very serious penalties, and it smacks of a kind of totalitarian ethos, which I think every sincere liberal ought to oppose. And just as I agree with Michelle about opposing the cancel culture of the right, I think it's incumbent on each of us to denounce it when it comes from our own side, and recognize that it's a threat to common liberties.
Bret Stephens, Michelle Goldberg, op-ed columnist of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, the Times' top cybersecurity reporter on the dangers of all those hacks. It sounds like an international spy novel. Last year, hackers broke into a tech firm called SolarWinds and put malware into their code. When the company sent out its next software update, that virus spread to thousands of its clients, ranging from big corporations to the Pentagon. It went undetected for months, and a vast trove of data was stolen. Russia is strongly suspected of being behind the brazen attack. This may have been the worst cyber attack on the US, but it's not even close to an isolated incident. Now, how could that happen to the country that created Microsoft, Apple, and Google? That's the focus of a new book. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arms Race. That important book by Times cybersecurity reporter Nicole Perlroth. The Times book review says, quote, "This is no bloodless, just the facts chronicle. Written in the hot, propulsive prose of a spy thriller, Perlroth's book set out from the start to scare us out of complacency, and it succeeds." So why do countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea feel free to launch cyber attacks on the US, the most formidable military and cyber power in the world? And why does it keep happening? And what can we do about it? Let's ask Nicole Perlroth. Nicole, thanks for joining us. This book came about through an agent for cookbook authors. How did that happen?
I love that that is your first question. Yes. So I'd been covering these cyber attacks for the New York Times, and publishers had reached out to me from time to time to inquire about my interest in writing a book. And the last thing I wanted to do after my day job covering the darker corners of the internet was go home and write a book about the darker corners of the internet. So I politely declined all of these nice publisher meetings. And then one day, Danielle Svetkov, who was an agent at Levine Greenberg Roston, reached out to me, and I did a quick Google search. And she was the agent for a lot of chefs in San Francisco that I could never get a reservation at their restaurant. So I figured at the very least, I would go out to dinner with Danielle, and she might be able to hook me up with a dinner reservation. And when I went to the dinner, she showed up with this dossier on me. It was a list of everyone I had mentioned in my articles who could make for a compelling character in a nonfiction narrative. She had chapter headings worked out, possible book titles, and I walked away from that dinner with no choice but to write a book.
In writing this book, I mean, you knew a lot about cybersecurity and the lack of it, but what did you learn? What more did you learn that you could tell the readers?
Well, I had always wanted to understand better the incentive structures, because I knew from where I sit in Silicon Valley that our main incentive is just at the company level, move fast and break things, get your product to market, get your software to market, keep shipping, was the mantra at Facebook and other companies. Get your product to market, get as much market share as possible before your competitor, and you will win. And I knew at the individual level, we just want what we want right now, whether it's an Uber or Instacart groceries or whatever it is. And security has always been really annoying. No one wants to think about creating long different passwords or updating their software or turning on two-factor authentication. But the thing that always surprised me was that the incentive structures were backwards in a lot of cases for government. You know, we expect government to keep us safe, but I was learning that in a lot of cases, the government would either pay defense contractors or vulnerability brokers to find vulnerabilities in commonly used software like Microsoft Windows, like your iPhone or Android phone, not so they could help fix it, but so that they could hoard it and use it for their own espionage operations to spy on terrorists or Russian diplomats that we suspected of being spies, et cetera. And that was not necessarily a problem 3 decades ago when we were all using different technology. But for the most part, we're all using the same technology now. We're all using iPhones or Android phones or Microsoft Windows, whether you know it or not. You might not have a Windows PC, but Windows is now baked into the power grid, into your electronic medical records, into water treatment facility operations. So now it created this moral hazard. If the US government was choosing to keep a vulnerability unpatched, so it could potentially use it to spy on your communications or potentially implant itself in Iran's grid or Russia's grid, that necessitated that they would also be leaving Americans less safe. And I knew from my perch at the New York Times that more nation states were getting clued into the potential of digital vulnerabilities for their own war planning and espionage operations, and that more nation states were knocking on our doors to see just how deep they could get into our critical infrastructure and into some of our most vibrant companies for intellectual property theft and ransomwaring our hospitals to hold them hostage so that they would pay a ransom. And all of these attacks were succeeding because for the most part, we haven't been focused on our cyber defense for the past 2-3 decades. We've been focused on access and convenience and speed, and software has been eating the world, as Mark Andreessen put it a few years ago. But when he said that, he wasn't thinking about the security implications. Nobody was. But these days, we are now the most targeted country on earth. And you could argue we are the most vulnerable because we have been hooking up so much of our critical infrastructure online. So adversaries like Iran, oh, go ahead.
2 things that you raise in the book that are really striking. One, that a lot of this is the fault of the American government, both with Stuxnet setting a precedent and the lack of preparation on our part. But just how vulnerable are we? How worried should we be about a risk to our infrastructure, to our military, to everything else?
Well, the thing is that these foreign adversaries and cyber criminals have seen that they don't have to come at the Pentagon or Cyber Command directly. They can come at private companies. And a stunning statistic is that more than 80% of America's critical infrastructure, which is an extremely boring term, but just means our water, our power, our hospitals, our elections, et cetera, 80% of it is owned, operated, and maintained by the private sector. Some of these companies are Pacific Gas and Electric that have the big budgets and resources to hire former intelligence analysts and keep track of nation state threats and put in place expensive intrusion detection protocols and technology. But most of them are municipal water treatment facilities that have 1 or 2, maybe if they're lucky, 5, 6 people on staff. Probably none of them are trained security engineers, and they often have to rely on outside contractors to monitor their systems for potential intrusions or to make sure their chemical balance is healthy or that the pressure or temperature gauges are at the right levels. And that access, that outside access, can be and has been increasingly exploited by nation states and cyber criminals who see that this is our soft underbelly.
Nicole, let me ask you 2 quick questions. One, is there anything private anymore? Is there any privacy? And 2, what have you done to make your information more private?
There is no privacy anymore. I mean, I spend most of my time focused on nation state cyber threats. And then very significant threats like the ransomware attacks from Russian cyber criminals that keep hitting our hospitals, et cetera. But when you just look at some of the New York Times coverage of what data marketers can do, just with our location data from our phones, it's stunning. You know, we had the privacy project that looked at just freely available information being collected by a commercial data marketer, and just the location data alone let you find a Pentagon official who attended the 2017 Women's March. You could see when people were going to motels in the middle of the night and potentially who they were meeting. So no, you know, privacy is dead. So what do I do because I am so aware of these threats? Well, I've chosen that I'm not going to be a tinfoil hat person, okay? I'm not going to go into a cave and live my life in a state of paranoia. So I just do the best I can. And usually doing the best you can means asking yourself, what is it that you have that would be of interest to a nation state or cyber criminals? Most of us are not nation state targets. I do consider myself a nation state target. Go ahead, Sam.
Tell us in one sentence what you do quickly.
I turn on two-factor authentication on everything. I don't click on links or attachments, and I use Signal, the encrypted messaging app, to communicate with sources, and I use pen and paper.
Good advice. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyber Weapons Arms Race by Nicole Perlroth. Thanks for joining us. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.